In the 1700s, socks, stockings, and other hosiery were made by skilled artisans. To become a fully qualified framework knitter, you had to go through a 7-year apprenticeship. In the 19th century, downturn in profits meant that wider frames were introduced by manufacturers. These were faster, but produced inferior work. The unskilled workers that worked these frames were called colts, and they maximized the income for the manufacturers, but to the detriment of the artisan knitters. In Nottingham and Loughborough, the framework knitters organized. And over 2 decades, they destroyed many of the wide frames and other labor and cost-saving devices used by manufacturers. They developed along the way a fictional figurehead, General Ned Ludd. This was the origin of the Luddites. Now, they were somewhat successful in trying to stop this new technology coming in. They delayed the mechanization of shearing in Wiltshire, weaving in Norwich, and new frames in Trowbridge. But a decline in profits in the knitting industry meant that the machines were eventually brought in. And today, automated machinery runs most of the hosiery business. It wasn't so much that the Luddites were scared of the technology. It's just that this new technology disrupted the established tradition, and they felt like they needed to fight back for their jobs. In 2010, San Francisco, Uber was launched with timeshare limos. And the innovation really there was that you could order a cab from your phone and see where the driver was at any point in time and not actually have to talk to someone to actually order a cab. In 2013, UberX was launched, which was a ride-sharing app that ordinary drivers could use to monetize essentially driving from point A to point B with passengers along the way. Over the years, though, Uber became much more of a classical taxi company, though. And along with it brought many controversies, including ignoring and evading local taxi regulations, pricing out existing cab companies, increasing the congestion on the roads and the dependency on cars, exploiting labor law, evading responsibility for rider and driver safety, and essentially they were one of the first companies to establish the low-pay gig economy. In 2021, after pushback from drivers, Uber in the UK recognized the GMB union, which guaranteed them a national living wage, holiday pay, and a pension plan. The controversial approach that Uber took over the years finally paid off after decades of no profit at all. Essentially, they made their first profit in 2023. But in the UK, drivers are now recognized as full workers and not self-employed contractors. There's much more competitive market, and riders and drivers understand that there's an algorithm that you have to kind of play against to enable the most beneficial distribution of rides to both drivers and riders. Uber changed the way that cab rides would be taken forever. In 2012, a set of skydivers demonstrated the first Google Glass by jumping out of a helicopter onto the roof of the conference center in which the Google I/O conference would be held. In 2013, the first consumer units shipped. Now, these were augmented reality glasses that had a front-facing camera that allowed for constant recording and streaming of live video. They quickly became synonymous with concerns about invasion of privacy, however. The first users were called glass holes, and they were evicted, essentially kicked out of bars and restaurants in San Francisco, where they mostly were, and they became somewhat of a pariah for the technology. After significant privacy concerns from the public and the high price tag of these glasses, in 2015, Google eventually closed the project. Google Glass was peer pressured out of existence. So Google Glass might be dead and buried, although I just read today that they're coming back again, so that's great. But AR glasses are more generally back. They're more subtle than ever, though. So this is a pair of Ray-Ban Wayfarers, which they've partnered with Meta, which is the owner of Facebook and Instagram, etc., to bring in this classic Ray-Ban style, but with augmented reality glasses. Now, these are sort of problematic because they are almost like a stealth surveillance technology. The camera is much less obvious. The little light that shines when it's recording is not very bright, and so you can't see it in high light areas, like outside. And basically, it's very, very hard to tell who's actually wearing them if you're used to seeing people in Wayfarers. We don't call people that wear these glass holes anymore. Not only because we don't necessarily know who's actually wearing them, but because over time we've been ground down by the endemic surveillance that we have within society. We're used to being recorded, we're used to being streamed, we're used to being uploaded to the internet. The failure of Google Glass led to eventually the reluctant and unwitting social acceptance of these particular glasses. So we have a clear pattern here. We have a new technology comes in, and along with it some hype and buzz that's created by the manufacturers or the developers, or a response to some sort of cost-cutting mechanism. There's a societal impact they maybe didn't necessarily foresee or ignored. And then there is a pushback by the people who use that technology or who are affected by that technology, which then eventually leads to the modification of that technology. Either they become more heavily regulated, they become more subtle or devious in the way that they operate in the society, or in rarer cases, they might actually listen to what we have to say and become societally acceptable technology. This pattern is very common in new technologies that come straight out of the development life cycle and hit society in ways that maybe they didn't necessarily expect. However, the hype cycle that these manufacturers often go into tend to overshadow the pushback that might actually occur at the very early stages of the technology. So it can take time for this pushback to gain momentum. This is also because developers and investors promise huge rewards if you take on their technology. It might be financial gains, it might be personal, might be personal improvements to your life, but a lot of these things are often couched as something that might happen in the future. So while we wait for that future, the impact, the negative impact occurs. So the technology conflicts with existing social values and expectations, and these values are really what they are underneath is an expression of an ethical value. So some ethical values in these cases I've just been talking about include things like dignity at work for Uber and framework knitters, justice for appropriate pay, transparency for who is responsible and how work is distributed. And for the Google Glass example, privacy about being recorded, dignity for those being recorded, autonomy to opt out of consenting to be recorded, and transparency, once again, about how this data is being used. As technology becomes integrated into society, it helps to create these new norms and expressions of these values. And this is based on the response that society has to the technology. So we have to stop and think about what it is that we want to build. What world do we want out of this technology? How can these new technologies work for that purpose? Now, technology companies often think that they're doing good by default. They're responding to some need. It's not always the case. They think, though, that by default, whatever they create can only really come to good things. But if that were the case, why is there often such an initial cost to society? Why do companies resist feedback? And how can we minimize the cost and time spent integrating these technologies ethically? Is it actually worth the price? Now, there are never any easy answers to these questions, but we'll have a little bit of a go at it. So in terms of the initial cost, one of the ways that we can think about this is how technology companies make money. Now, venture capital is kind of the backbone of the startup industry in terms of technology startups, and venture capital rewards a growth at all costs mindset. So, for example, with Uber, the investors in Uber weren't so worried so much about the fact that they weren't making a profit over a long period of time, as long as they increased their market share and their growth. In terms of Google, which is a publicly owned company, the shareholders at Google don't really care so much about whether the product is any good as long as it's making lots of money, and there's this kind of growth and continuous innovation that they go into at Google. So this encourages reckless experimentation, and it forces them to essentially ignore potential future negative impacts. Because if you think about the negative future impacts, that will actually damage your hype, which will damage your growth. So society, in the meantime, while they're sorting all of this stuff out, pays the price. And often it pays the price when it's too late to stop development as well, because these companies just don't really care about it until it hits the ground. So even in the hosiery companies, if you go back to the 1700s, it wasn't that they were out to destroy the traditional artisan framework knitting, it was that they wanted to solve a monetary cost problem, right? And so they didn't really foresee that would actually completely destroy this artisan knitting skill. So it's very easy to resist social acceptability when you're rewarded by your investors or your shareholders, or these machines help with cost saving. But the long-term social benefit is really, really hard to kind of envisage, and it's often quite expensive if you want to go into it. But unfortunately, society picks up the tab, so it makes it beneficial for companies to do it anyway because they don't actually have to take responsibility for the negative impacts. So how can we minimize these costs to society? How do we convince companies that this pushback that we might have as a society is actually beneficial to them? And how can we integrate tech more beneficially looking towards the long term? How do we make sure that these tech companies do better than to make bad socks, invasive glasses, and a race to the bottom cab system? Unfortunately, the incentives just don't align, and we can't really change those incentives very easily. So what we can do is we can improve the methods that we use to push back. So we can already see throughout history that there are methods that have been used to push back that actually work. Regulation, unionization, professionalization, peer pressure, stigmatization, even physical breaking up and smashing up knitting frames. Although I don't suggest that we do that for modern technology companies, perhaps. Let's look at let's just take a little break and just look at a current technology that's in the middle of this kind of process, right? So I want to talk about AI. Everyone likes talking about AI. I don't want to talk about the classic AI machine learning that is actually very, very useful when applied correctly, for example, in identifying cancer cells or learning how to speed run Super Mario Brothers. But I want to look at the machine learning process called large language models, which are in the middle of this kind of hyped up emergent stage. So these large language models really take a lot of data in, do all of this sort of stuff, and then they want to respond to basically respond to human queries with human-style outputs. So that's the key goal for that. However, there's a lot of hype around the possibilities that this could actually bring, including the holy grail of artificial general intelligence, which is completely impossible with these kinds of models, just straight up. So what we've got instead is we have these AI chatbots, we've got image, audio, video generators, and anyone, according to the manufacturers, can become a great artist, a great film director, a great writer, and save money in their businesses if only they employ artificial agents instead of human ones. And of course, the human ones want to push back. So we've seen strikes. We've seen technology that poisons the well by corrupting the data that's used to train these models. We've seen unionization. We've seen stigmatization and peer pressure to not use this technology. So right in the middle here, right, we're at this societal impact. We're heading into the pushback stage. The sheen is coming off the AI penny. We also know that basically things are starting to not live up to the hype, and there are a lot of negative outcomes from using AI. For example, there's a significant environmental cost for training. Data is scraped without consent. And the models just can't distinguish between artificial outputs or human outputs. And this is a problem for future training of future models. And to be honest, the customers are just not finding it as useful as the manufacturers promise. For example, companies are needing to abide by promises that AI chatbots are making legally. They're having to deal with the company chatbots making false claims about their products and services. They've been recommending competitor products, and in terms of the AI companies themselves, they're starting to deal with the fact that public data sources are now being restricted. It's actually really hard to monetize this stuff as well. It's very expensive because you have a lot of costs from training and processing all the data for the models. So it's actually really hard to kind of translate that into something that somebody might actually want to buy, and it's very expensive. And frankly, the models are just putting out mediocre content that everyone is immediately wowed by, and in 2 weeks' time, they'll be like, here are all the problems. So regulation is catching up, pushback is happening, but we have to think a little bit, has the whole AI development actually been worth it? This whole journey that we've had to create this technology, has it been worth it? The harms that we've had along the way, I mean, theft of creative material, perpetuation of bias, regurgitation of sensitive data, misinformation, fraud, and use of models to defame, imitate, sexualize, demean, and blackmail people. I mean, is that really worth a bunch of mediocre chatbots? In fact, the UK government has now brought in a law to make creation of deep fake non-consensual sexual images an offence, which is something that would never have needed to occur before these large language models came in. The regulation is slow, though, but it also eventually does catch up. But unfortunately, sometimes it's a little bit too late for those people who are affected. So unfortunately, the worst parts of the AI hype cycle are probably here to stay, but some of the best parts might be as well. Much like the automated knitting frames, the apps for hailing cabs, which a lot of cab companies now use, and the attempt at making AR glasses trendy, we get a little bit of both these things. And what happens is, along the way, is that society changes how it responds to this technology. It changes expectations, norms, and attitudes in that process. But we have to think about, is this how we want our technology to be developed and deployed? It runs roughshod to market at the expense of human beings. Do we really want these companies to benefit while society bears the cost? And do we want technology integrated into the fabric of society that is dependent on the whims of shareholders, billionaires, and the next quarter's financial statements? So there's a few things that we can do. And as a society, there's some broad-scale things that we can do to start off with. We can embrace unionization. Collective action has been shown to work against these big companies. We have SAG-AFTRA, the union in the US, looking at the film and media industry. We can bring in a greater role for academics and professional societies, understanding what it is to be a professional in this industry, and bring in codes, standards, good practice, benchmarks for professionalism. These are all used in other areas of technology as well. We can fund research and development that rewards ethical and social value alignment. We can require governments to use responsible technology companies in their procurement chains. We can certify software engineers, much like we certify civil engineers for critical physical infrastructure. We can do that for critical digital infrastructure as well. But ultimately, what we need to do is rethink the funding and market approaches that reward this growth at all costs mindset, and instead look at rewarding long-term thinking. But that's a lot of things that we have to do as a society. What can we do as people, individuals, ourselves today? Well, the first thing we can do is we can resist the hype and be critical of the technology that we use, and be critical of the technology that our friends, our family, our businesses use. We can ask, who gains from this technology? We can ask, at what cost do they gain from that technology? And we can be brave and say no to using harmful technology, despite what the masses might do. We can persistently and patiently advocate for alternatives, educate others about the harms, because that will show us that we can stand up to these big tech companies as well. So if we want a world in which technology is thoughtfully developed to benefit society, we need to push back. Instead of destroying the knitting frames, we can destroy the growth at all costs mindset and hold technology companies to account for the societal costs of their innovations.